It is now my great honor to introduce Dr. Ben Carson, who's the founder of the Little Patriots program, the founder of the American Cornerstone Institute. He spent 30 years serving as the director of the pediatric neurosurgery department at Johns Hopkins, and then followed that with 4 years as the United States Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He was born in Detroit to a single mom with a third-grade education who worked extra jobs to make sure that her children had the opportunity to live the American dream. Dr. Carson is the author of a number of books. He is a true American hero. Welcome, Dr. Ben Carson.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for your interest in making sure that our young people are educated in the right way. It's so important in the times that we live right now. And I must start with a little confession. You know, everybody has these little moments where they say, I belong to this board, I belong to this group, and therefore you have to take everything I say with a grain of salt. Well, my confession is I am not politically correct. And that doesn't mean that I try to offend people, because I try not to offend people. But the fact of the matter is, these days it's very hard to talk to a group of people without offending someone, because you know, people are so sensitive to everything that you say, and they take things the wrong way. And so I'll just say, it's not my intention to offend anyone. And if anyone is offended, too bad. You know, one of the things that is so amazing about our country is that it is the focal point of hope for people all around the world. Everybody in the world knows about the American dream. Have you noticed that? Does any other country have a dream? You've never heard of the French dream, or the Portuguese dream, or the Canadian dream. Now, the Canadians thought they had one until recently, but you know, the fact of the matter is we're the only ones who have a dream. And you know, my dream was to be a doctor. I just loved things that had to do with medicine. I used to listen to the stories in church and Sabbath school that featured missionary doctors, people who, at great personal expense and sacrifice, would travel all around the world to bring not only physical, but mental and spiritual healing to people. They seemed like the most noble people on the face of the earth. And I decided when I was 8 years old that I would become a missionary doctor. And that was my dream until I was 13. At which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out, and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on TV they seemed like rich people, you know. They lived in the fancy mansions and drove Jaguars, and they had these big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway. So I said, this is going to work out extremely well. And I started reading Psychology Today. I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems. I would sit them down and stroke my chin and say, tell me about your mama. But, you know, in college, we had some amazing professors. One of my professors in psychology was Anna Freud. the daughter of Sigmund Freud, and I was all prepped. I was ready to become this great psychoanalyst. But then when I got to medical school, I started meeting a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? No, I'm just kidding. Some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But what really attracted my attention were the neurosurgeons and the amazing things that they could do with the brain and the spinal cord. I just was so attracted. And people were saying, that's not the right field for you. You shouldn't do that. Because at that point, there had only been 8 black neurosurgeons in the world. But I'll tell you a secret. The Lord does not dispense talent based on race. So you don't have to worry about stuff like that. And I took to neurosurgery like a duck takes to water. It was just so amazing. But the other thing, you know, as a youngster that I remember tremendously were the Bible stories. I knew all the Bible stories, and it had an enormous impact on who I was. But I still had a problem. I was not a good student. I was a terrible student. That's probably the worst student you've ever seen. Other kids loved having me in the class because nobody had to worry about getting the lowest mark on a test. As long as I was there, I took care of that. But I did admire the smart kids, though. I would never tell them that I admired them, but I really did. I remember there's one kid named Steve. He was the smartest kid, and he wanted to make sure you knew that. You know, after a test, he would always come and hold his A in your face and say, let me see yours, let me see yours. You wanted to let him see it, all right. But you know, my mother was the only one who really believed in me. And she was always saying, Benjamin, you're much too smart to be bringing home grades like this. I brought them home anyway, but she was always encouraging us, saying, you know, things. And, you know, one of the interesting things about my mother, who was probably the wisest person I ever knew, you know, she came from a huge family in rural Tennessee, was shuffled from home to home, never got more than a 3rd grade education, got married at age 13, moved to Detroit with my father, where he was a factory worker and a part-time preacher. She discovered that he was a bigamist, had another family. I remember telling that story at a graduation at the University of Utah, and nobody thought it was that strange. See, I told you I'm not politically correct. Now, of course, they don't do that anymore in Utah. But obviously, she thought that was pretty strange. And that resulted in a divorce. And of course, with no education, you know, we were in a bad situation. But some relatives in Boston took us in. And it was in a typical tenement, large multifamily dwelling, boarded up windows and doors, sirens and gangs, rats and roaches, murders. Both of my favorite cousins were killed. I mean, it was a horrible environment. But after a couple of years, we were back in Detroit, and I was this horrible student. And my mother just didn't know what to do. My brother was also doing poorly. And she prayed. She had such faith in God, and she prayed that He would give her the wisdom to know what to do to get her young sons to understand the value and the importance of education. And, you know, she didn't believe in excuses either. She never made excuses. And if anybody had an excuse, she did, but she would never make excuses. And if an excuse ever came out of our mouth, the next thing out of her mouth was a poem called Yourself to Blame. And it was probably one of the most important things she did in our lives, is teach us to take responsibility and not to make excuses. But God gave her the wisdom for what to do. At least in her opinion, my brother and I didn't think it was that wise. Because it was to turn off the TV. Let us only watch 2 or 3 TV programs during the week, and with all that spare time, we had to read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. She put little check marks and underlines and highlights. She couldn't read them. But I hated it in the beginning. But after a while, I really began to love it because we were very poor. We never had money for anything, but between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere. I could be anybody. I could do anything. And I started reading about incredible people, entrepreneurs and explorers and philosophers and scientists and surgeons. And I began to understand that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you is you. It's not somebody else. It's not some circumstance. And I got to the point where if I had 5 minutes, I was reading a book. I went from being the dummy to being called a bookworm. And within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. And I remember after a test going up to Steve. And I said, Steve, how'd you do on the exam? And he poked out his chest. He says, I got a 91. And I said, well, gee, that's too bad. I got 100. And I said, next time if you need help, let me know. Now, that was probably a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to that turkey. Yeah. But, you know, the thing to recognize is that I had the very same brain when I was at the bottom of the class that I had when I was at the top of the class. What does that tell you about human potential? The fact that we are made in the image of God. And it's a matter of how we teach. You know, you hear people saying all the time, I'm not good at math. Everybody is good at math if they're taught the right way, if they're taught the right fundamentals. It's just like reading. What if you knew all the letters of the alphabet except A, E, O, S, and T? What could you read? You would get frustrated every time you picked up something, even though you know 21 of the 26 letters. You fill in those 5 letters and voila, all of a sudden it works that way. And particularly math and science, everything builds on something else. And if you have all the right building blocks, it becomes very logical. It makes a tremendous amount of sense. But God gave us such a gift with the brains that he provided for us. I mean, take a human brain and put it next to an animal brain, let's say a dog. And I'm not talking about dogs, but the fact of the matter is people are smarter than dogs, most people. But you look at the surface topography of those brains, they look very much the same. Frontal lobes, parietal lobes, occipital lobes, temporal lobes, brainstem, cerebellum, midbrain. But you know, the dog's midbrain is much better developed than the human midbrain. What does the midbrain do? Among other things, react. That's why animals react so much faster than people do. Cat-like reflexes. But the human brain has much better and bigger frontal lobes. And what do you do with those? Engage in rational thought processing. We, because of those frontal lobes, have the ability to extract information from the past and the present and integrate it and learn from it and use it to do complex things, complex calculations, to project into the future, a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years into the future. Those are the kinds of brains that God gave to us. We can analyze. We can judge on the basis of the content of the character. That's a frontal lobe function versus reacting to the color of the skin. That's a midbrain function. And yet we have school systems teaching things like critical race theory that teach children to act like animals instead of using the incredible facilities that God gave us to analyze the content of people's character. And that's what Martin Luther King meant when he said he dreamed of a time when people would be judged on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. So important that we teach our children the right way to think. And what does the Bible say? Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he'll not depart from it. That's why it's so important to get to children at an early age. Vladimir Lenin, one of the chief Marxists, what did he say? He said, "Give me your children to teach for 4 years, and the seed that I sow will never be uprooted." Think about that. Now, a lot of us, we think that all of this craziness that's going on in our society right now, that this is of recent origin. It's not of recent origin. You know, Khrushchev, 60 years ago, said to Eisenhower, "Your grandchildren's children will live under communism and we won't have to fire one shot." That means there's been a plan. And interestingly enough, if you go and you look at the congressional record, January the 10th, 1963, 60 years ago, read into the congressional record from Skewson's book, The Naked Communist, were the 45 goals of the Communist Party for America. Now, I'm not going to read you all of them, but just some of them, 60 years ago. Number 15, capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. Number 17, get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum, get control of teachers' associations, put the party line in textbooks. 60 years ago. 20 and 21. Infiltrate the press. Get control of book review assignments, editorial writing, policy-making positions. Gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. 24 through 26. Eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. Break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, healthy. 60 years ago. Number 35. Discredit and eventually dismantle the FBI. Interesting, isn't it? Number 40 and 41. Discredit the family as an institution. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. Emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents. Attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and retarding of children to suppressive influence of parents. 60 years ago. So what the American people are going to have to be made to understand is that we're being played. We're being played like a fiddle by people who intend to fundamentally change our society. And we all have to play a role. We have to realize that, you know, God put us here for a reason. He gave us these insights for a reason. I mean, think about children being raised today in this environment. You know, for the longest time, they had to wear masks. Masks that didn't work. Masks that kept people from being able to correlate what's being said with facial expressions. That's a very important part of social development. And then they're being told that they may be harboring some horrible disease. Horrible, that would kill their grandmother even though they may not feel it themselves. So stay away from your grandmother. And you know, grandmothers do get older and they do die. Now you got some kid feeling guilty that they had something to do with that. And then they're telling little white kids, you and your ancestors are evil people, are oppressors who have caused problems for everybody else. You know, I have a friend, his granddaughter came in and she said, Daddy, Grandpa, am I evil because I'm white? Where are they getting this stuff? Black kids and minorities told that you're victims. This society is unfair. I mean, think about that. While they are trying to develop their self-image, they're having all this stuff laid on their shoulders. And if that's not bad enough, you may not be a girl or a boy. Think about that. I mean, what is that? That is child abuse. Because these children are very impressionable. And they're very curious. If you take somebody who's impressionable and who is also curious, and you start telling them, you know, you may not actually be what people told you that you are. I mean, how does that make any sense at all? That whatever you think you are, that's what you are? If you happen to be 5'1", but you think you're 6 feet tall, you're really 6 feet tall. I mean, how crazy is this stuff that is going on? And now, if you don't believe that a man can have a baby, that you're some kind of a transphobe. The last I checked, men did not have ovaries and uteruses, and they had an X and a Y chromosome and not 2 X chromosomes. I mean, that's what the science says. Why are people trying to deny science and confuse our young people? Well, you just heard it. This is a plan that has been in process for a long time on how to fundamentally change America into another system. And we have to be the bulwarks against this, the things that really fight it. You'll notice that they're also trying to get us, the American people, to believe that we are each other's enemies. Driving wedges between our society on the basis of race, age, income, religious affiliation, political affiliation, gender, all of these things makes no sense. But it is highly effective. And you'll see how it's working. All you have to do is open your eyes and look around and see people saying that transgender women who are actually men can play in women's sports. You know, when I was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, I had many contentious congressional hearings about this because the left felt that transgender women should be able to be taken care of in women's shelters. Well, the women didn't want to be harassed or even to be around men. A lot of them were in women's shelters because of men who were very disruptive in their environment. And a lot of them said, we would rather sleep in the forest in the middle of winter than to be in a place with those people. But the congressmen who were on the side of the left were just so persistent. I suggested, why don't we have a shelter for transgenders? They didn't want a shelter for transgender. They want to be in with the women. And just like the transgender men now, I was reading an article about a women cyclist, and they had a tournament, and it was won by a transgender woman who was really a man. The ones who came in second and third, who were real women, did not want to share the winner's podium. So the transgender had to stand there by themselves. But I don't blame those women, because men and women are different. And vive la différence. I'm glad they're different. They're made different. They should be different. You know, it was God's plan in the beginning, in the book of Genesis. He said male and female he created. He didn't talk about any transgenders or anything in between. And those who want to fundamentally change our nation know that that is a perfect wedge. Because if the Bible talks about something as being wrong, and you can say the Bible was wrong about that, then you can say the Bible was wrong about virtually anything. And it's the camel's nose under the tent. And that's why they're so intent upon it. And why we must teach our children the right kinds of things. Common sense, which is no longer common, as you've seen. But that's the reason that we developed the American Cornerstone Institute. You know, after the last administration ended, I said, now I can retire. Because I had tried retiring before and I failed. So I said, this time I'm going to retire. But, you know, after a few weeks of seeing the direction that we were going in, I realized I wouldn't really be having any fun on the golf course or traveling around the world and doing things while watching my country deteriorate. I mean, this is a country that is worth saving. It is an amazing place, put together by incredible founders. They're trying to denigrate our founders now, but these were amazing men. And they studied every system of government that had ever existed as they were trying to put together a constitution for this country. And in 1787, at the last Constitutional Convention, it was so ruckus. There were so many disagreements. They were fighting to such a degree that it looked like the whole thing was going to fall apart. And the elder statesman, 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin, got up before the assembly and he said, gentlemen, stop. Let's get on our knees and let's seek wisdom from God. And they knelt down and they prayed and they got up and they put together a God-inspired document, the Constitution of the United States of America. And when Franklin came out of that building, a woman said to him, sir, what do we have? A monarchy or a republic? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. If you can keep it. Right now is the closest we have ever been to losing it. And it is something that we must recognize. We must be able to fight effectively if we're going to be able to keep that republic. And that's why myself and a number of outstanding folks from HUD came together to create the American Cornerstone Institute, based on Cornerstone Principles that made this into a great nation. Our faith, our Judeo-Christian values teach us how to react to each other. to love your neighbor, not to cancel your neighbor if they disagree with you, not to hate your neighbor if they have a different yard sign, to love your neighbor. Incredibly important pillar of America. And then liberty, freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. So many different kinds of freedoms that were so vitally important. Even the freedom to protect yourself, the Second Amendment. You know, we have people who say, well, you don't need a high-powered rifle to go deer hunting. The Second Amendment is not about deer hunting. The Second Amendment is about being able to protect yourself from an overly aggressive government that comes to suppress you. We need to make sure that people actually understand why these things are there. Because in virtually every society that has converted from free to communist, the first thing they do is they take away the people's ability to fight and to protect themselves. So we must never allow those freedoms to disappear. Our founders put those things in there for a very specific reason. Liberty, incredibly important pillar of America. And then community, the sense of community, vital to who we are as a nation. All over this country, there were small communities, 20 families, 50 families, 100 families, no other communities within 50 or 100 miles. Not only were they able to survive, they were able to thrive. In many cases, they could barely even communicate with each other. Some families were from England, some families from Spain, some families from Africa. They were from all kinds of places. But they understood something important. The good for all. The concept of the overall good for the community. And that's why they were able to combine their talents and their skills to create growing communities. If it was harvest time and Mr. Johnson was in the apple tree picking apples and fell out and broke his leg, everybody else harvested his crops. It wasn't even a question. Nobody sat there and said, what were you doing up in that tree? They just harvested his crops for him. They helped them. If somebody got killed by a grizzly bear, the rest of the community took care of their family. That was something that characterized America. And then the last pillar, life, respect for life, from the womb to the tomb. And as we've grown more callous in regard of life, we've grown more callous in our relationships with each other. And it makes it easier for people to convince us that we're enemies. And we are not each other's enemies. So American Cornerstone was there to provide guidance and insight to the people of America about who we really are. We can't forget those pillars. We can't forget the fact that our families and our faith, those were such incredibly important points of strength for us. And think about it, if we were such an evil and racist and horrible country, why are all these people trying to get in here? And when they got here, wouldn't they call all their friends and relatives and say, don't come here, this is a horrible place? This is not what we're seeing at all. And I talk to a lot of people from other countries, and the consistent question that they all ask, what happened to you guys? What is happening to us? The rest of the world is noticing it, but it doesn't have to happen. Because if God was willing to save Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of 10 people, we got this. But we have to do our part. That's the key. He's not going to do it all, and we've got to be willing to do what we can. And just remember, in 1831, when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study our nation, because the Europeans were fascinated, they couldn't understand how a fledgling nation, barely 50 years old, was already able to compete with them on virtually every level. This was impossible. How in the world was this going on? And he came and he looked at our government, and he was very impressed with the separation of powers, the checks and balances that existed, the creation of an environment that allowed businesses to flourish, that encouraged entrepreneurship and innovation. And he looked at our educational system, and he was so impressed. He could find a mountain man, and the guy could read. The guy could tell him about the Declaration of Independence. But the thing that impressed him the most were our churches, and those fiery sermons that came from the pulpits that gave our people a sense of right and wrong, of morality. And he ended his large 2-volume set, Democracy in America, with these words. He said, "America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great." And that goodness comes from our sense of God and the role that he plays. Our founding document says that our rights come not from government, but from our Creator. And if we can instill that in our young people, what a difference it makes. It's never too late to instill that either. I remember as a young attending neurosurgeon, I was thinking that I was pretty cool. I said, "You came out of Detroit, you went to Yale, University of Michigan, trained at Johns Hopkins, became chief of pediatric neurosurgery at one of the leading institutions at age 33. I said, "You are a bad dude." That's what I was thinking, you know. But then along came this young fellow from the state of Georgia. And he was a child prodigy. At age 2, was already reciting Bible verses. But at age 4, he was losing all of his functions, losing his speech, losing his ability to walk, double vision. All kinds of things were going on. He was diagnosed with a malignant brainstem tumor. And the parents were people of means, and they sought many opinions. And everybody told him the same thing. Take the boy home, keep him comfortable until he dies. And they ended up at Johns Hopkins. And I remember seeing that boy roll into that ward. And I was thinking, what am I supposed to do? He was barely moving, barely breathing. Eyes were looking in opposite directions, foaming at the mouth. And the parent said, "Doctor, the Lord directed us here because we would find a Christian neurosurgeon, and the Lord was going to use him to heal our son." And I said, "But this is a malignant brainstem tumor. This is inoperable. There's nothing that I or anyone in the world can do for this." And they said, "But doctor, the Lord is going to heal our son, and he's going to use you to do it." And I said, "Okay, I'll tell you what." MRIs were brand new at that time. I said, "Let's do an MRI. Maybe it'll show something that the CAT scan doesn't show." We did an MRI. All the neuroradiologists looked at it. Same diagnosis. Inoperable, malignant brainstem tumor. I told the parents, they said, "But doctor, the Lord. I said, look, maybe 1 in 1,000 times the scans are wrong. And maybe this is a big reactive fungus ball or something that looks like a brainstem tumor, so I'll do a biopsy. Oh, thank you, doctor, thank you. I took him to the operating room, went down to the area of the brainstem. There was a big, pinkish, gray, ugly tumor. I took a frozen section. It came back high-grade glioma, a very malignant tumor. I took out as much as I dared, closed them up, went out and talked to the parents. I said, I'm sorry, but it looks like it was what everybody thought it was. And only the Lord knows how long someone is to be here and what the impact of their life is during that time. We'll understand it better by and by, all the things that we say to people. And they said, thank you, doctor, but the Lord. And as I walked away, I was thinking, I have never seen people with this kind of faith before. Fully expecting that the boy would deteriorate and die, but instead, over the next few days, his eyes started looking in the same direction. And he started handling his secretions. And I said, what is going on? I said, let's do another MRI. And we did, and guess what? There was still a big, ugly tumor. But way off in a corner, there was a little sliver of tissue. And I said, is it possible that this tumor is actually not in the brainstem? It's outside of the brainstem, and it has crushed and displaced the brainstem, and maybe we should go back in. And the parent said, by all means. And took him back to the operating room, opened him up under the microscope. The nature of the tumor had changed. And as I peeled it away, layer by layer, I got to the last layer and peeled it away, and there was, in fact, a glistening white brainstem, crushed and displaced but intact. Long story short, that boy walked out of the hospital and today is a minister. And one of the oncologists came to me after that. He says, Ben, I've always been an atheist, but I'm a believer now. But it wasn't for him. It was for me. Because I was thinking that I was doing all these things, and I was this great neurosurgeon. And I realized at that point that it wasn't me at all, it was God. And I said, Lord, from now on, you be the neurosurgeon, and I'll be the hands. That's where the term gifted hands came from. And after that, all kinds of amazing things began to happen. But I knew who was behind it. And that's what we, as Christians, have to teach our children. The Lord is always looking for individuals that he can use effectively. But what happens in most cases, people begin to achieve a little bit of success, and they think it's them. And they don't realize that it's God, and he has to move on to someone else. And right now, it is such a critical time to allow ourselves to be used by him, because our country is under severe attack. And if we don't stand in the brink, we will lose that amazing country. And we think about all of those who have preceded us, who came before us, and the sacrifices that they made so that we could live in peace and freedom, so that we could worship the way that we wanted to worship. You think about World War II, the whole world about to come under the influence of evil. You think about how our young women went into the factories and built more airplanes, tanks, and mortars than anybody could imagine. You think about how our young men, 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, many of them lied about their age so that they could fight for our country. Think about D-Day as they were approaching the shores at Normandy and getting off of those flotation devices and being mowed down by machine gun fire. 100 dead bodies laying dead in the sand. 1,000 dead bodies laying dead in the sand. Were the others afraid? Did they turn back? Yes, they were afraid. But no, they did not turn back. They stepped over those dead bodies. And they overwhelmed the Axis forces, knowing in many cases that they would never see their loved ones or their homeland again. Why did they do that? Did they do it for themselves? No. They did it for you and for me, so that we could live in peace and freedom. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is our turn to do it for those who are coming after us. Thank you very much.
Land of the free, home of the brave. That's what makes the United States. Now let's take a journey with the spirit of freedom. Liberty will lead the way.
Let's take a star-spangled adventure. Star-spangled adventure.
All the things you'd want to know about America's in this show. So come on, all you patriots, let's go.
Trouble, sir? Reports say American troops are retreating towards Baltimore, heading our way. The British are pursuing them.
We'll be ready, sir.
That is why I had this flag made so large. I want every British ship and soldier to know that we are here and we are ready for them.
Did he say that America's fighting the British again? Oh, that's right. America won their independence, but now, 31 years later, the British have declared war again in what's called the War of 1812. The British have burned Washington, D.C., along with the new White House. What's left now is the city of Baltimore, Maryland. It's the last large city to defend. Should it fall to the British like the other cities, America could lose the freedom it won just a few decades ago. The Americans are having to retreat toward the fort, being chased by the British. However, Colonel Armistead and those in Fort McHenry don't know just how important that extra-large flag will turn out to be. Meanwhile, in the Chesapeake Bay...
Thank you, Commander. My client is grateful we could negotiate his freedom.
Who's he calling dumb?
No, Doctor! Freedom! Come, let us depart to our truce ship. Commander, what is the meaning of this guard? Our mission is only of peace. I am afraid you need to stay with us a while longer. We cannot let you go, or you will give away our position for the attack. What attack? On Fort McHenry. His Majesty's fleet is about to destroy this fort. With it gone, so will your short-lived independence. Guards, ensure that our guests do not leave their vessel.
Who's going to wrestle?
Come along, Dr. Beans.
Double time, men!
Sir, we can defend either our land or our sea, but not both at the same time.
Do not underestimate the power of a soldier fighting for freedom, Lieutenant.
You know these warships now have rockets.
The British flag will never fly over this fort.
Notice anything different about this flag? Right! right. It has 15 stripes and 15 stars. But it didn't start out that way. When America was only 13 colonies, the flag borrowed from Britain's flag. But after America's independence, it changed to 13 stripes, alternating red and white, and 13 stars representing the now 13 states. By the time of today's events, America had 2 new states, Vermont and Kentucky. So the flag added 2 more stripes and 2 more stars. This is the 15-star flag that, as we will see, inspired amateur poet Francis Scott Key to write our national anthem.
Mr. Key, this is hardly a fair fight. Our fort will certainly fall to the British.
Steady, Dr. Beans. We shall prevail.
Yes, we should put them in jail.
Closer! We must get the ship closer! Beg pardon, Commander, but the merchant ship we sank last week is blocking us from getting any closer. Their own treachery is protecting the fort!
So, what do you see now?
I can make out the fort.
Oh, I fear for those boys.
Wait. Yes. I see it. Our flag is still there.
What about a bear?
As long as that star-spangled banner waves, we are winning.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, all the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land and of the free and the home of the brave?
Yes, the American flag was still there, along with America's freedom still protected. This battle turned the tide of the war. Soon after, the British packed up and went back home. They will never go to war again against America, and later they become allies and friends.
What are you going to do with that poem you wrote last night?
Not sure. I called it Defense of Fort McHenry. It might make a good song. I think I'll show it to a friend of mine who publishes music. Maybe a few people will sing it.
But you need a bell to ring it.
Well, I should say, more than just a few people do begin to sing his song that later is called the Star-Spangled Banner. And we still sing this important anthem to remember how our freedom must always be protected. So now we always stand for the flag and the national anthem because they always stand for freedom. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well, Dr. Carson, you've given us a little taste of the Little Patriots program. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, you know, recognizing what was going on in our schools, particularly during COVID, and seeing some of the things that COVID was actually a blessing in disguise, because all of this had been going on for quite some time, but we were able to visualize what was going on, and we said we can't just complain about it. We really have to oppose it. So we said, let's come up with a supplemental teaching program that can be used in all kinds of settings: homeschool, private schools, charter schools, public schools, that actually give the full extent of who we are as Americans, why we believe what we believe, why we're so fortunate to be a part of this country. You know, it really doesn't matter where your ancestors came from. They come from England, they come from France, they come from Brazil, they come from Nigeria. You are probably better off here than you would be in the place where they came from, because this is the greatest country in the world. And we have to make sure that we preserve that. We want to make sure that our children understand that. But also all the aspects of our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we cover all of it. But if you're objective in your analysis, you'll see that there's a lot more good than there is bad and ugly. And you know, some of the things like CRT, 1619, they just seize upon the bad, and they try to build everything around that and said that's who we are as a nation.
Right.
That's not the case. We learn from those things. And it is our history that gives us our identity. And our identity is the basis of our beliefs. And that's why, you know, when ISIS goes into a place and they conquer people, what do? They get rid of their history. They get rid of the museums, they get rid of the libraries. And we're allowing that to happen in our society. And we have to make sure that people, and particularly our children, understand that every part of our history is important. And we learn from it, and it makes us into better people. We don't try to cover things up. We don't try to rewrite things, because that doesn't work. The same is true in the Bible. And that's why Satan goes through such efforts to try to distort and tell things in a different way. You know, started that in the Garden of Eden.
Absolutely.
You know, did God actually say that? Nah, that's not what it really is. And this is the same thing that's going on today, and that's why a classical Christian education is so vitally important. And you know, I encourage people to go look at this, because you know, what you just saw is just one of the episodes. There are multiple episodes and new ones coming out every couple of weeks. And there are also other types of interactive programs, K through 5 learning. You go to littlepatriotslearning.com, or there's a logo. I think they're going to flash it up on the phone. Just take your phone and look at the QR code. It'll take you to the right place to get involved. And here's the best part. When you look at all the stuff that's there, you're going to say, this is very expensive. I don't know that I'm going to be able to afford that. You can afford it because it's free. And yes, it was very expensive to produce, and it is very expensive to produce. But there are wonderful Americans all over this country who underwrite this program so that we can make sure that it's available to everybody.
Now, one of the things that you say about the American Cornerstone Institute is that it's not just a think tank, although it is a think tank, it's a do tank.
Exactly.
So what are some of the things that, that you're doing?
Well, I'll give Glenn Beck credit for that. He was the one that said, you're not just a think tank, you're a do tank. But in addition to the Little Patriots program, we have the Executive Branch for America. And this is a learning program, also free of charge, by the way. But it teaches people the fundamentals of our government, and particularly the executive branch, because what happens is you have so many people who may come in sometimes as staffers or as fresh college graduates, and they go into their state houses or to Washington, D.C., and they're like deer caught in a headlight, because it's really sort of complex the way everything works together. It takes them a year to get acclimated to what's going on. If they take this course, they can go there and hit the ground running. We also are trying to encourage conservative thinkers to get involved in government, because so many of them say, no, I don't want to get involved, I don't want my family to suffer, I don't want any. But if everybody who thinks logically does that, what's left? What kind of people are left? And right now in the federal government and the executive branch, there are 4 million employees, 4 million. When a new president comes in, he can replace about 3,000. So that's a drop in the bucket.
Right.
So we got to get more people particularly involved in the permanent positions, because when new administrations come in, they just say, I was here before you were here, I'll be here after you're here. Anything you want to do, I'll just kind of slow walk it, it won't get done. That's why when conservative administrations come in, they don't seem to be able to get very much done, because people say, oh yeah, we'll do that. Just go to sleep for a couple of years and they'll be gone and our people will be back in.
Last question. As you might imagine, on the app, I've got lots of political questions. Mm-hmm. And
no, I'm not running.
But you did last time. So the question that is repeated over and over again is, first of all, is there a faithful party left in America? And if there is, who's your pick to be the next nominee for that faithful party?
And that's a very important question, actually, because the answer to this is critical if we're going to get our country back. The reason we have a primary process is so that we can go through and listen to everybody and see what they've done. Now, one of the candidates has an advantage in the sense that we know that his policies work, and they work very well. We don't know that about everybody else, but we need to listen. And here is the key. Whoever wins the nomination, that's who we have to support. We cannot have little pet peeves and say, I can never vote for this person, because to do that is the same as voting for socialism.
Dr. Carson, thank you.